This is the next in the series of discussions that have been built around the essays in this book, We Own the Future of Democratic Socialism American Style. These events have been co-hosted by the Democratic Socialists of America Fund, New Press, which published the book, and Dissent magazine. This month's installation is also sponsored by, as I said earlier, the Democratic Socialists of America's National Electoral Committee. If you've missed previous events, there'll be links in the chat box as well. So tonight, our focus is on Mijin Cha's chapter in We Own the Future, entitled We the People, Voting Rights, Campaign Finance, and Election Reform. We will be talking about the fight against voter suppression and for electoral reform. So the panelists for tonight's discussion on voter suppression and electoral reform are Mijin Cha, an assistant professor of urban and environmental policy at Occidental College. She is also a fellow at the Worker Institute of Cornell University. Dr. Cha's research explores the intersection of inequality and climate change, particularly labor and climate conditions. Her current research focus is on just transition, how to transition fossil fuel communities and workers equitably into a low carbon future. Next is Miles Rapoport, currently a senior practice fellow in American democracy at the Ash Center of the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. He served in the Connecticut legislature representing West Hartford from 1984 to 1994, and as Connecticut's Secretary of State from 1995 to 1998. He also served as the president of Demos, a public policy center in New York City, and as the national president of Common Cause. Next, we have Renitta Shannon, who defeated a four-term conservative Democratic incumbent with a bold progressive message in 2016. In January 2017, she was sworn in as Georgia's State House Representative to represent the 84th District. In her first year as a legislator, Renitta was awarded Most Valuable Legislator in The Nation magazine's 2017 Progressive Honor Roll for her work on sexual assault policy. She closed out the second year in office by leading the legislators' boycott of Governor-elect Brian Kemp's first public address for wanting what she called a gubernatorial campaign of hate against half of Georgia, targeting Black and brown voters and the LGBT community and women. Renitta is also the co-founder of Her Term, a Georgia-based initiative committed to targeting, recruiting, and electing progressive women into office. Her work has been featured in Time Magazine, Cosmo, and the Elite Daily. She's also a member of the Democratic Socialists of America, DSA. And lastly, I am your moderator, David Dualde. I served as DSA's National Youth Organizer and Deputy Director, then as the Political Director of the Bernie Sanders-inspired Our Revolution, and as Research Analyst for Every Voice, a small donor national advocacy organization. Today, I'm here as the Vice Chair of the Democratic Socialists of America Fund Board. I'm going to say a little bit about how we're going to run tonight's event. The first half, which will be run about 30 to 45 minutes, will be a discussion generated by questions that I ask the panelists as the moderator. And in the last half, for about the same amount of time, the panelists will answer questions that you ask in the Q&A box. So please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to ask questions as they come to you during the discussion. The chat box, on the other hand, is for making comments to each other and asking technical or logistical questions, such as if I'm speaking too softly or going too fast. But it will be closing now so that we can focus on part one of the discussion. It will reopen for part two of our discussion. But the Q&A box will be open the whole time, and for someone will be track of questions for part two. If you're on social media, you can ask questions there as well. So we are anxious to get to as many of your questions as possible. So I've asked the panelists to limit their answers to no more than 5 minutes. So for the first question, and we'll pitch it to Mijin first, could you each begin to describe what drew you to democratic socialist analysis of voter suppression and electoral reform?
Thank you, David, and thank you all for having me here today. It's a particular honor to be here along Miles Rapoport, who I'm lucky enough to call a mentor and friend, and Representative Shannon, who's really at the front lines and such a champion for so many progressive causes. I'd like to say a special hello to my UEP 300 class, who I forced to be on this webinar today. So I would say for me, before we get to the socialism part of democratic socialism, we have to talk about the democratic part. And we do not have the democratic part. In fact, we're far from it. So this chapter is a synthesis of a lot of work that I did at Demos under the leadership of Miles that looks really at how the wealthy dominate our electoral system and how the voices of average people are not being heard, and some ideas for how we can protect and expand voting. You know, we the people is not we the people and hasn't been for a very long time. And until we fix the corrosive impact of money on democracy, we face a losing battle in the fight for a more just future, whether it be ambitious climate policy or healthcare as a right, or addressing stagnant wages and frankly, an offensively low minimum wage. So, you know, when we think about democratic socialism, for me, we have to really fix the democratic part. So that means that we eliminate the role of money in our electoral system. We make voting something that is a part of civic engagement and not something that people have to jump through hoops to do. And we finally have a representative democracy, which means that the voice of the people is reflected not just in who is making decisions, but in the types of decisions that are being made. So as I say in the chapter, you know, a lot of the things that we talk about, like increased minimum wage, even things as what we say as so radical as the jobs guarantee, which is the federal government being the employer of last resort, so that everybody who wants a job has access to a job. These kind of policies actually have large support amongst our electorate, but they receive very little attention amongst our elected officials because our system is so dominated by money and by wealthy interests. And in fact, we can see again that in the chapter I talk about how the elected officials in Congress really overestimate how conservative the electorate is because all they hear from are people who are wealthy. And we think about it, it's not just people who donate, but often congressional staff is very wealthy. Elected officials themselves are very wealthy. So you see this echo chamber, not of progressive values, but of money and the importance of money and the role of money. So until we really decrease this toxic influence that money has on our electoral system, and until we really realize the fact that voting is a right, not a privilege, the ideas of socialism will never be able to advance in a country like the US. And I'll pass it to Miles and Renitta.
Miles, you're still muted.
I had a little bit of the same progression as what Mijin described just a few years earlier. I started out as a community organizer way back in the late 60s and early 70s, partly against the Vietnam War, but a lot of community organizing around fundamental economic and neighborhood issues, whether it was utility rates or property taxes or rent control or any number of things. And then, you know, subsequently got into the legislature as a result. But I think what many of us realized who were working on these economic issues or community issues was that what we were running up against was a democracy that wasn't working, or it was working but not for ordinary citizens. So if we did a ballot initiative on electric utility rates, we discovered that the utility companies were able to put unlimited amounts of money into these ballot initiatives and could always, you know, overcome us. If we went to the legislature, we discovered that campaign contributions from the Realtors Association and the landlords were tilting the playing field dramatically against the idea of rent control, and on and on. So we started to have an evolution, those of us who were in community organizing, that said, we need to work on our democracy issues. We need to get democracy right, or get it more right at least, if we're going to hope to win on these other issues. So when I went to the legislature, which is in 1984, I think I was the only person who said, I really want to be on the elections committee of the legislature. Everybody wanted to be on the appropriations committee and the finance committee. And so I was put on that committee relatively easily and became the chair relatively easily, because even at that time, and even more recently, the issues of democracy were seen as sort of over here on the side, process issues. Sometimes the province of either the voting rights community, you know, centered in the African-American community, or of kind of process nerds. But what's happened over the last, I would say 10 years, and you can see it dramatically right now, is that democracy has become a front and center issue in the country. Whether it's the campaign finance issues that Mijin was talking about, or the voting rights issues that we're working on, or the very fundamental notion now of a peaceful transition of power after an election. We had a debate last night that, among other things, which we'll talk about, one of the 6 segments was about democracy and how are we going to keep the integrity of our voting in the process. So I'm delighted that that's the case. We have a long way to go. And the last thing I'll say is the one thing I think is important is we've made a lot of progress. It may not seem it watching Donald Trump in action, but in state after state, when I first went to Demos, same-day voter registration, which increases turnout anywhere from 5 to 7%, and Mijin talks about it in her chapter, was in 6 states, period. And now it's in 23. Early voting was virtually non-existent back then. Now this year, there are 41 states where people are going to be able to vote early, and that's going to make a huge difference. So I'm not, my nickname at the Demos office occasionally was Pollyanna Pete, because I always thought everything was going to work out just fine. But I do think it's important when we talk about the voter suppression issues, which we should, that we also talk about how the movement, a democracy movement and a grassroots movement, have made real progress in opening up the system. And that, I think, will end up with very large turnouts and significantly better outcomes over the long haul if we can survive this November. Renitta?
Well, and I'll just add in, Mijin got so much right in her chapter. As I was reading it, it really felt like she fully understood what had been taking place, particularly in the state legislatures. There are 3 areas that I'd want to point folks' attention to. The part where she talks about how legislators have a skewed perspective about how conservative the general public still is, or the support for these conservative policies really stood out to me. And there's a reason why, just even beyond the influence of money, there's a reason why that also is a thing. And that's because the majority of state legislatures across the country are part-time positions. And so that immediately affects who is able to serve. It means that you are going to cut out folks who have to work 9 to 5 jobs, because that's typically the time that we are actually in session voting. And it tends to make the legislatures a lot to be overrepresented by those who are retired and overrepresented by those who are independently wealthy. And so that absolutely skews what working folks need. It absolutely skews different policies that folks may think are popular to move forward with. So that's one area that I thought she was right on the nail with that. Some of the other things that she mentioned about how the onus is on the voter to make sure to protect their right to vote, I cannot tell you how true that is. So I actually have the pleasure of serving on the Governmental Affairs Committee in the Georgia House, which deals with election law. And I've been on that committee since being elected. I was sworn in 2017. And I can tell you that every single year in that committee, it has been a nonstop stream of bills coming through that are meant to suppress the vote, make things more difficult for voters to keep up with as far as registering to vote, staying registered to vote, and exercising their right to vote. And so it has been a relentless attack against just allowing free and fair elections. And that is why you see so much of the voting rights issues happening in Georgia, where we are at the center of all of this, because the committee feels like it was built as if to make sure that those who want to vote actually have as tough a time as possible when it comes to voting. And so she's absolutely right in that we really have things turned around where it should be where folks are having to opt out of voting instead of making it so hard for folks to try to obtain the right to vote and then keep their right to vote. And so I would say there are a lot of things in this chapter that it would be great for folks to really take to heart and understand what is happening, because so much of the system, the way that it is currently built, is really not made for what the majority of the public, it's not made to reflect the interests of the majority of the public, and certainly not for working folks.
Thank you all. That was a great start. So I will go to the next question, which will be a little longer. So, and as you guys, I appreciate that everyone touched upon the chapter. In the first section of the chapter that Mijin wrote, it provides an eye-opening chart showing the differences between how the wealthy and general public feel about the range of job and income programs, from the minimum wage to the job guarantee, as she alluded to earlier. Our elected officials almost always side with the wealthy, prioritizing the desires of the 1% over the needs of the 99%. How does this happen, and what can we do about it? Mijin, why don't you start one more time, and then we'll change the order in a little bit.
Sure. This is a really great question. And as Renitta pointed out, a lot of it is because, the elected officials are part of the 1%. So their interests are the wealthy interests, are the ones that are advancing. Part of the problem is, as you mentioned, a lot of state legislators are part-time, so it's who can afford it. That's also true in Congress, right? When we think about congressional staff salaries, they're really low. So you can only work there if your parents are wealthy. And there is this, again, this camaraderie amongst elites, right? So it's not just that you can be Democrat or you can be Republican, but you went to the same boarding school. So you all have each other's back. You kind of see this a little bit when, Democrats kind of refuse to acknowledge that Republicans are no longer abiding by norms because they think, but these are the norms that those of us in high society have abided by. So I don't understand why we're not abiding by them anymore. So I think, one solution to that is more people like Renitta and Miles running, like Jamal Bowman, like Cori Bush, like Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, people who actually have worked and don't depend on inherited wealth for their survival, have a very different idea of what it means to survive. So for instance, the fact that we have a $7.25 minimum wage, I really find offensive, because in what world can that be enough money to survive and feed your family? And yet the answer to that very often is that, well, then you should just get a better job, which shows such a disdain for labor and such a disdain for workers, because many of these people have never been workers themselves. The second reason why I think this happens, and again, Renitta and Miles can speak much more to this, is that you just need to raise so much money to get elected, just, millions of dollars just to be in office. So, we can think about this, with Mayor Pete and his famous wine cave of billionaires. And I like to take any opportunity I can to trash Mayor Pete. So here's another good example. You have to be extremely naive and have been asleep for the last million years to think that people in that cave don't want something by paying that money to be there. Right? So this is exactly how, again, the interests of the wealthy advance. They don't just give you money because they think it's a nice thing to do. They're giving you this money because they want something in return. And in some ways, it's legal corruption, right? So it is a pay-to-play kind of system. And one way to get around that is some of the work that Miles has also done in Connecticut about public financing. So in many countries, elections are publicly financed. And here that discussion can be really fraught, but in some ways, I always think of it as we pay either way. Either we pay to have an electoral system that supports candidates who aren't from wealthy, who supports candidates who don't have to spend all their time raising money, to call it dialing for dollars, or we pay because there's just so much money, public money given away to wealthy and corporate interests. We are in the latter system. And that is far more expensive than if we were to invest in public financing and have a publicly run election system. So I think the only way to counter capital is people power. And the way for us to gain power is for us to start organizing and for us to build and wield power. But until then, I think the system that is dominated by the wealthy will continue to be dominated by the wealthy. We need to elect different people so that different decisions can be made.
Well, I want to make one point and tell two quick stories. A little bit of color commentary here. The point is that, it ought to be obvious, and it was attempted years ago, to simply limit the amount of money that could be contributed to campaigns. But unfortunately, we have been operating since 1976, since the Buckley v. Vallejo Supreme Court case said that spending unlimited money on your campaign is constitutionally protected free speech. And that was sort of the original sin, in a way, of the campaign finance judicial system. And all of the decisions, from Citizens United to, you name it, there have been dozens, have emanated from that. And what it means is that it's impossible to control money coming into a campaign. And increasingly it has been so. So what we have been forced to do is say, what can we do that is within that constitutional framework until we get a Supreme Court that is willing to relook at the fact pattern and change that basic campaign view. And the system that has been developed has been a voluntary public financing system. And we do happen to have a really good one in Connecticut that has made a difference. where you get you have to raise a certain amount of money from small donors, only small donors count. And once you do that, you get a grant from the state to run your campaign, and you don't have to raise any more money. And what legislators in Connecticut have told me is that the biggest single change is that the power of the lobbyists have been diminished, because the power that they have had, and they have in many, many legislatures, is based on the campaign contributions that they can make or bundle from their clients. And that leads me to my first quick story. When I first got to the Connecticut legislature, the top lobbyist in Connecticut was the lobbyist for the beer and wine wholesalers. And that was his main client, but he had lots and lots of clients. He had about 30 different clients. And anytime a legislator was running, he would get all of those clients to contribute the money. So he had an enormous amount of power. But we had a bill that we were trying to pass called the bottle bill. It was an environmental bill for returnable bottles, which is now the norm. But it was bitterly opposed by the bottling manufacturers. And we finally got it passed. And the only way it got passed was that the bottle manufacturers and the supermarkets were able to keep the money from the bottles that were not returned. So they actually made money out of this deal. So we had a bill to say, how much money would the state get if instead of giving that money to the wholesalers when people didn't return their bottles that they had paid their nickel for, it went to the state. So he proposed a study commission to see how much money the state was losing. And I thought, well, that's a no-brainer. Obviously, we should know what that is. So I was astonished when the bill lost 30 votes in favor and 121 votes against. And everybody knew that that was because the lobbyist, whose name was Pat Sullivan, had wired it completely from start to finish. Okay, what's happening now is that because candidates don't have to go to the lobbyists for money and don't have to go to wealthy donors, they spend a lot more time talking to real voters and real people, and a lot less time sitting on the phone and dialing for dollars. And I think I'm going to stop there, not to go on too long. I'll save my dialing for dollars story for a little later in the program. Somebody should ask me about it. Renitta?
Sure, I'll try not to repeat what everyone else has said, but everyone has been right on the money about what they've been saying about why this is.
Right on the money, so to speak.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. But one thing I'll point out, and I'll go back to this point about who makes up the state legislatures. As I mentioned before, most of them throughout the country are part-time. So here's a great exercise for everyone to do. Take a look at the amount that legislators make in the country. There are several maps that will tell you how much legislators make. There are only 3 states that actually have full-time legislators. And so what that means is that can be your only job. And because of that, that really does curtail who can actually serve. And I think that that leads directly into why we see the issues that we see, because most of the folks who are serving are completely out of touch with today's problems. So I'll tell you a quick story that kind of illustrates what I'm speaking about. I serve on the insurance committee also. And I was having a conversation with a Republican legislator a Republican woman legislator, and we were talking about why Democrats and progressives were insisting that we expand Medicaid. Now, expanding Medicaid is something that is very popular in Georgia, even amongst Republicans. Everybody, something like 70 to 80% of Georgians want to expand Medicaid. Everyone needs it, regardless of party, and everyone understands the effects that we've seen in red states when they have expanded Medicaid. So this is something that wouldn't cost anybody any political capital. She said to me that she didn't understand the reason that we would expand Medicaid, because when she grew up, her parents had such great values that they understood that instead of putting their money into cell phones and putting their money into luxury items, they just made paying for healthcare a priority as something to do with their paychecks. And so, Mijin, you're right, you've got the same expression, shaking your head. That's exactly what I found myself doing. So I said to her, I said, but that was 60 years ago. You get out a calculator right now and you do 725 times 40, and you tell me where there is money to pay for rent when we know that there is a rental crisis in this country. You tell me where there's money to pay for daycare, and then you tell me how you're going to have money left to pay for healthcare. This is not a values issue about people not wanting to afford these basic necessities. It is that people literally don't have the money. And so I think that story really, really illustrates how just out of touch folks are who are serving, and the way that the system is built. It is locking out those of us who do understand the issues and who do understand how things are currently and what changes need to be made. So I say that is a lot of how this continues to happen. And then, of course, as everyone else has mentioned, the financing of campaigns. In helping progressive women run for office, I talk to women all the time about how, it looks different for, depending on who you are, for you to run for office. It is the case that the general public still sees women as less investable when it comes to giving them money for campaigns. So even if you are trying to run a strategy where you're not going to take lots of money from lobbyists or from corporations, it's not a level playing field. If you are an African-American woman, if you're a Black woman like myself, people see you as even less of an investment. And so there are so many hurdles that are built into this system that really make it where it is built for those who have been able to vote the longest, and that is white men to serve and and continue to be the majority of the electorate.
One of the things, I'll do a quick addition to that. One of the things that happened when Connecticut passed its public financing laws is it permitted a tremendously more varied group of candidates to run.
I was going to say that, yeah.
Because you didn't have to say to the powers that be, I can raise $35,000 or $40,000 and I can run for this seat. All you had to do is be able to get 500 contributions, even of $5 a piece, and you could do it. And so we had the legislators themselves were liberated, but it also meant that people who did not have wealth or didn't work, weren't lawyers or insurance agents or bankers, could easily run for office. And the legislature is much more diverse and much more progressive as a result.
And I'll add on something to that. I think that Connecticut is one of those states that actually pays legislators a living wage. So what you're talking about is fixing the problem on the front end. But a large problem that we have in southern states and for the majority of the country is, if you actually manage to get elected, what job are you going to do? Because most employers do not, you may want to do your public service of serving in the legislature, but because we have a system that is so based on capitalism, and capitalism is so promoted in this country, most employers feel like, hey, you can do your public service if you want, but I need you to be here and make money. So that looming problem of what happens after I get elected, and being a state legislator doesn't pay enough to diversify the age of folks who get elected, diversify those who have backgrounds to get to, as far as who's serving, really creates some obstacles. I have found that in the Georgia legislature, what you do for a living most determines whether or not you can actually run. So most of the folks there you either have to work for yourself, so you have to be a business owner, or you have to have retired at least from one job, or you just have to be independently wealthy. If you don't fit into one of those categories, it's highly unlikely that you will be able to make it once you do get to the other side. And even in the case of myself, I always talk to folks about my story. Yes, I was an organizer in my personal time before being elected, worked on labor issues, worked on racial justice issues, pretty much everything with the exception of environmental issues. And, but I know that I would not have been in the position to be able to run for office had I not worked for a pharmaceutical company right before running, and having the ability to save, to have time to sort of figure it out after I got elected. So that's a major hurdle that we have to figure out. And same thing for those who are trying to raise young children. We have almost no folks in the legislature who have young children because you don't have time. Well, I will say no women with young children in the legislature.
Fair distinction. And I'll just make one quick anecdote, I think. There's a DSA state delegate in Maryland, which is also a part-time legislature, Gabe Acevedo, who lost his job because he took a principled stance against representing police unions, because he didn't believe that they were part of the labor movement. And his union said, who he worked for, was like, no, that's not where we stand, and he got let go. And this was in the New York Times. And so it's the contradictions too. I mean, he works for labor, but you can imagine there's less, which is a position I think people on this call, the Democratic Socialists, wouldn't agree with the position the union took, but in the aggregate, that union would probably take positions we like much better. So that constraint on the undue burden that your employer would have, I think, is an excellent one. So let's go a little bit more to the roots. I'm going to kick this one to Miles first, and then we can go Representative Shannon, then Mijin. So the chapter points out the United States, which likes to think of itself as a bastion of democracy, is actually an outlier among democracies in how much it's spent during elections and how long the election season lasts, creating incredible barriers for any political candidates who are not independently wealthy, like we just discussed. How and why did the US develop so differently from other, I would say, like advanced bourgeois democracies would be the DSA version of how we're looking at the OECD countries?
Well, it's interesting. There is one kind of interesting constitutional reason for it, which is the United States as the commitment to the First Amendment and how free speech has been interpreted. For instance, in the UK, there's a time limit on campaigns. You can't campaign until I think it's like 5 or 6 weeks before the campaign. You get a certain amount of money from the government, and that's it. And so the campaigns are relatively inexpensive. But in the United States, because you cannot limit when the campaigns start, because if I'm a candidate, if I want to be a candidate and I want to talk about being a candidate and I want to file my committee and run, I can do that. And one of the reasons that the campaigns have been so long is because there's so much fundraising that needs to be done. So the first year of a campaign for Congress is mainly spent fundraising and hopefully accumulating the money, to do that. So I just think it's, most of the other countries, the advanced countries, have some form of a public financing system. They also have a much stronger party system where generally people run as representatives and part of a slate. The United States has been much more individualistic about candidates, although obviously when it comes to the presidential race at this point, it is, sort of party driven. But I think the amount of money that's being spent on the campaigns because we can, and because it works, because the candidate, 85% of the time, the candidate who spends more money wins the race. It is a nice development, a good development, that Bernie was terrific about, and it's happening now in the Biden campaign. It certainly happened. Is the explosion of small donor contributions through the internet, and in a funny way, that's been a campaign finance reform that has taken place not legislatively but through technology. But in any case, I think the United States spends, multiple times what other countries spend, and it's because that we cannot, or we choose not to, enact limits on the time of campaigning or the money that's being spent on the campaigns. Oh wait, I have to finish my last story. I just realized. Was telling about how the lobbyists prevented us from even finding out how much the state was losing on the bottles. So fast forward about 10 years, and public financing passed, and the candidates didn't have to rely on this particular lobbyist for money. The bill was passed to find out how much the state was losing. The state was losing $24 million a year. A bill was passed to say that money should go to the state. And guess what? That's the exact amount that the entire public financing system for the state of Connecticut costs. So one bill that was passed because of the lobbyists couldn't dominate anymore paid, and in fact, more than paid for the whole public financing system. So it was, talk about a win-win all the way around. That's a story with a happy ending. Who's next? Renitta, I think it's you next. Go ahead. Why are we such an outlier?
I'll jump in and agree with you on the money issue. It really has skewed so much of what our elections look like. As you mentioned before, those who are even trying to move forward with small dollar donations, it's really tough because everybody can't be Bernie Sanders. You can do that if you're running for president, or if you're running for US Senate, or these campaigns that generate a lot of media. But most folks can't even tell you what a state representative does, or what a state senator does, or what a school board member does. And so I would say that there are folks out there who are trying. I've managed to do really well, not relying on corporations and relying on lobbyists for support. But that's also because I came from community organizing. And so I got elected by the people, and that's who keeps me there. Of course, I was outspent 4-1 in my original election because, it's really, really difficult. So I would say that the gerrymandering looks the way that it does because of money, and there are far too few people who are willing to do it the hard way, which is really growing and building people power. That's what allowed me to win my election, but there are far too few people who are willing to do that. The other thing is that there's so much money being spent, not directly through elections, but spent on electioneering. And when I talk about electioneering, I'm talking about these groups that spend all their time making sure that they can create the most gerrymandered maps. I mean, the type of support that conservatives have, these think tanks that sit around and all they do is figure out ways to maintain power. You think about what happened in North Carolina, where a judge said that these maps were drawn with almost surgical precision to make sure that the districts were so heavily gerrymandered. We've seen this here in Georgia where, we only should go through redistricting every 10 years with the census, but we've seen bills come through where literally we'll have legislators, conservatives come to Black legislators and say, hey, if you give me your white voters, we'll swap. Give me your white voters and I'll give you my Black voters in a neighboring district. That way it's easier for both of us to get reelected. And that kind of stuff can easily pass because the general public doesn't have time to pay attention to that kind of stuff. And so the gerrymandering, it's almost at a point now where I feel like in some states like Georgia, I don't even know if it's possible to gerrymander these maps any more than they have been. And I think that's why there's such an attack on the census. And I'll tell you one quick antidote to kind of just illustrate what I'm saying. Literally in the district that I live in, the side of the road that I live on obviously is in the district because you have to live in the district in order to represent it. But if I walk just across the street, that is literally not a part of my district. So.
I agree, obviously, with everything that Renitta and Miles have said. And the length of the election season is also tied to the fact that we have a whole economy around elections, right? So it's pollsters, message testers, communications firms, consultants. I study just transition, so I feel like we could just justly transition them to another industry, maybe working for like the IRS to like figure out when people are paying their taxes. But the incentive is to have this kind of endless money cycle, right? We are in a spending arms race because it's not just the election itself, but all the things that come with the election. So all of those people, it's like an ecosystem that needs to be fed. So we should just transition them into something maybe more productive for society than having. So the impact is that when we try to do things like shorten an election system, those are the interests that are against it, right? It's not just the elected officials and what we think of as the party and the wealthy interest. It's the entire ecosystem of elections that needs to then transition to another, perhaps they could be solar installers, but some other industry that otherwise the incentive is to keep the spending high and the election season long.
Yeah, and then so I think what we can do for the next question is I'll kick it to Representative Shannon first because she touched upon it a little bit. It'd be great to dig in to her experiences dealing with this because I think especially, I'll say the question, but I think that exchange, that bartering is really fascinating. I never know, I've heard things about that, but it's a really interesting way that this stuff happens like between Democrats and Republicans. And I think also one of the ironies is like Eric Cantor, who was the former, I think, whip from the GOP, lost his seat actually partly because the Republicans had gerrymandered his district to be so right-wing that they didn't expect that. When he got the Tea Party challenger, it was like he didn't expect that because it became such a reactionary district. So sometimes it's funny how it ends up hurting them too, the establishment too. But the question is, another badge of dishonor in U.S. democracy is the creation that we created the word gerrymandering. So where does this practice come from, and how does it continue to disenfranchise voters on the basis of race, class, and other factors? So, Representative Shannon, especially if you want to talk to us about what's going on in Georgia, and then people can add, and then the other panelists can add on too. But I'd love to hear more about that.
Sure. So gerrymandering, plain and simple, is very race-based. It basically is a process by where you are taking a look and trying to decide who you think is most likely to vote for a political party and then building maps based on that. And so in Georgia, for example, some of the things that we've seen have been that there's been more than one time where there has literally been a bill outside of the redistricting process where a Republican has said, hey, give me your, let's switch voters to a neighboring legislator. And because most of the people who serve in state legislatures are not those who came from a background of community organizing, because most of them are not activists, some of these folks are, they will literally tell you they ran for office because a person who was in the seat previously was in their fraternity or was in their sorority or was their cousin or their husband. They are not there for the issues. That means that once they get in, they see their time in service as more about going to lobbyist dinners, and sort of taking the path of least resistance. And so bills that will make it easier for them to get elected, that would gerrymander their district even more and make both folks secure in getting reelected, are bills that are very attractive a lot of times to legislators. And so that's a lot of where the gerrymandering comes from. I've seen lots of bills that have been blatant in the way that they go after drawing these districts, meaning that, you know, even though all the districts have to have the same, everyone has to represent the same amount of folks. So like serving in the House, we've got 180 folks. Each of us represents about 50,000 people. You will find that districts, like my district, for example, looks like a spatula. It just does. It's got a box at the top and then it's very skinny, coming all the way down, running spans of the district that you would see that you would never think would be in one district. Another quick thing I'll mention, which is very sneaky, that I think does not deserve a lot of talk, or not enough talk, and this kind of goes back to the electioneering. In Georgia, conservatives have been so sneaky about finding ways to hold on to power that they have been running a strategy for the last 10 years or so, where specifically with Democrats, when it comes to drawing districts, they will specifically draw districts that have white tops and black bottoms. And I say that meaning that they will give you a district that has a wealthy white top and then give you the rest of the district that is majority black. And so they are now drawing these districts in such a sneaky way that it keeps competing interests going, even in trying to represent these heavily gerrymandered districts. So you have lots of communities pulled together that don't have common interests, and they do all that they can to make the districts very difficult to represent, in addition to them being heavily gerrymandered.
Let me answer the historical question and then a couple of comments about it, where it stands now. The word gerrymander comes from Massachusetts. The governor of Massachusetts was a person named Elbridge Gerry. I think actually it was pronounced Gary. And in 1792, he was responsible for drawing the districts. And one district that stretched from the top of Massachusetts all the way through Boston and down to the South Shore looked like a salamander. So that's how the word gerrymander came about, from the name of the governor and the district looking like a salamander. So obviously this is a long history in this country. For a long time, gerrymandering was a lot about just incumbent protection. The Republican leaders and the Democratic leaders would get together and, you know, a little bit, Renitta, as you were just describing, you know, we'll give you this neighborhood, we'll give this neighborhood, and we'll all whatever. But as partisanship has increased, in 2010, the Republicans decided this is a way to keep us in power. It's a racist way of operating, and it's also a fundamentally anti-democratic way of operating, because what it is a way of keeping allowing a minority to rule over a majority. But they did a thing that was called Operation Red Map, redistricting map, but was nicknamed Red Map. And they targeted a whole bunch of state legislative districts around the country, while the focus was on Congress and on other places. And they just won. That was the Tea Party wave year. So they won an enormous amount of districts and were able to control the redistricting process in 2011 in ways that are extraordinary and outrageous. I mean, you know, the examples are legion, but in North Carolina, when legislature drew the districts, even though the state is pretty much 50-50 in terms of Democrat and Republican, and we'll see what happens there this year, but they drew it so that there were 10 Republican districts, Congress people, and 3 Democrats, 10-3. And when they asked the Speaker of the House, why did you do this at 10-3 when the vote is 50-50, he said, well, I couldn't figure out a way to make it 11-2. So, you know, he completely was admitting that was an absolute illegitimate use of power. Now, fast forward though, it's interesting. I think this is another area where we have made a lot of progress. And the redistricting process that takes place in 2021 and for the elections of 2022 is going to be much less gerrymandered than 2011. Why? Not because of a change of heart on the part of the Republicans who have done it, but because there have been ballot initiatives in Michigan, Ohio, Missouri, a whole bunch of places around the country to create fair redistricting processes, either a citizens redistricting commission, which they have in California. That's sort of the model of it, and it's worked very well there. Or certain criteria that must be followed, or the nonpartisan legislative staff do the drawing, or it goes to the judge. Anyway, the process is going to be much less partisan and much fairer this time around. And in addition to that, in some of the places like North Carolina, where there was a super majority of Republicans, they don't have that anymore, and they have a Democratic governor. So they just don't have the ability to do this. So I think a combination of what will hopefully be a reasonable census, a full census, a good Democratic set of victories at the state level, and these reforms passing means that I think we'll have a better redistricting process come 2021.
I'll just add very quickly, the example in the book is that Pennsylvania had the same problem that Miles and Renitta have been discussing, right? Where it was so gerrymandered that the majority of the congressional delegation was Republican, even though the state is split about 50-50. They were sued and they redistricted, and then their recent crop of congressional representatives is about 50-50. So you can see that actually redistricting does work, and it will be a much better way to show the split of a state more equitably.
Great. So I'm going to ask one more question because I see some fantastic inquiries in the chat box I want to share. But I think we would be remiss not to discuss, and I think and at least one of the other questions from the audience will touch upon this as well, like the tone from the debate last night, which reflects a general mood in this country to be kind of polite. I think there's a real, obviously, tension. And so, the results of the 2020 election, given the current political climate, seem that they'll inevitably be contested by either side, though very clearly one side plans on contesting them given what President Trump said at the debate. So while the courts may decide the results of November 3rd, what can we do to curtail voter suppression on the local and national level? What can we do to protect the results of the vote, given what happened at the debate last night? Open that up to anyone who'd like to take it first.
Mijin, why don't you start us off?
I think that there are a lot of practical things we can do, and then there are power things that we can do. And I'm also eager to get to Q&A, so I'll keep my comments short. Also, just a little brag that a couple of those questions that are really great are from my students. So that is very exciting about the future of our country. Volunteer as a poll worker. Poll workers are not, there was a shortage of them. We need poll workers to make sure that elections are administered smoothly. I think, we have to be vigilant. Right now is the time when there is a full-on assault on voting and on our democracy. So, I very much believe that there is strength in numbers. So put on a mask, stay distanced, but, out in the streets, show that there's, basically I feel like we are up against a bully. And the only way to deal with a bully is to basically punch them in the nose. Not literally, because I don't believe in violence. But there are more of us. Right? I think that Trump has this thing of the silent men, they're the silent majority. But in fact, we are the majority. The people that believe in this democracy, that believe in the right to vote, we are the majority. And we should act like we're the majority. So we need to think about how do we build power, and not just build power, but we have to wield power somewhat ruthlessly. And I think those are the things that we can start thinking about. There's practical things like being a poll worker, being an election monitor, those kind of things that really help protect the vote. And then there is a long term, the idea of how do we build power and how do we wield power in a way so that we can actually reclaim our democracy.
Yeah, I'll just say similarly, there are lots of ways that you can volunteer so that you can help make sure that we do have a smooth election. I would say there are organizations probably in every state. I know the ACLU looks for volunteers to help watch what's happening at the polls and help report things. Obviously, please volunteer if you can to be a poll worker. With COVID going on, there were a lot of the folks who were poll workers and supervisors tended to be older. And now because of COVID, a lot of those folks who have the great experience will not be able to serve this year because obviously, you know, they don't want to put themselves in harm's way. So there's definitely a shortage of poll workers. And when that happens, that's always an issue. The other thing I would say is get to know what your local elections board is doing. All this stuff is handled at the local level, which means the person who's in charge of your county. So whether you have a mayor or you have a CEO in the case of DeKalb County, everything is controlled by your local government. Find out what your local elections board is doing and make it your business to attend those meetings and let them know that you're watching, because so much of what is happening is so coordinated that a lot of it is happening in the dark. And I'll tell you, these conservatives, they're not strong people. They don't have all this great backbone. They're getting away with this stuff because they are being allowed to operate pretty much in the dark. But when you challenge them, they essentially melt. And that's what I found.
I'd say there are comments on the two phases of your question, David. The first is, you know, what to do between now and November 3rd. And I do think that, you know, what is required is just a tremendous turnout. And I think we're moving in that direction. I think people are determined to vote, and the more people try to scare them out of it and discourage them and throw up roadblocks and screw around with the post office and take away drop boxes, I think that, you know, all that is motivating people even more. You know, there are already 1.3 million ballots that have been cast and counted, not counted, but cast already. So, you know, obviously, if you're going to vote by mail, do it early. Don't take any risks on the post office. If you're in one of the 41 states that have early voting, in-person voting, by all means do it. Don't wait till election day. And if you're going to go on election day, you know, mask up, bring a lunch, and, you know, be prepared to do your duty. So I think the election administrator's prayer, which I used to learn by heart, was, please God, let the results be outside the margin of litigation. And this goes to what's going to happen afterwards. Hopefully, there will be an overwhelming turnout, an overwhelming victory, and nothing for the losing side to do but moan and complain. However, if it's close, I do think that we will be in for a real constitutional crisis, and that's going to require a tremendous amount of political courage by people who are in legislative seats, both at the state level and in Congress. It's going to require judges to do their job and you know, count the votes. It's going to require election administrators to resist pressure and count every vote. It's going to require the media to be clear about the fact that we're not going to, you know, speed is not the issue here. Counting the votes fully and clearly is the issue. And then I think afterwards we are going to have a situation where people being in the streets, demonstrating in support of democracy. You know, I think it's going to look a little bit like some of those Eastern European revolutions that took place. I just think we are going to have to stand together and make sure that the will of the majority of the people in this country is not thwarted by whatever means are attempted.
Great. So I'm going to stick with the election question. Then I'm going to probably go to some broader future questions because it's a fascinating topic. Somebody asked a really solid question about last night's debates. They said in Trump's statement in last night's debate, in which he encouraged his base to watch the polls, is that a form of voter suppression?
Absolutely. It's a form of voter suppression because what they're trying to do is to make folks afraid to come out and vote. And this is not the first time that this has been done. Brian Kemp, when he ran for governor of Georgia and was still the Secretary of State, he was on Twitter saying, hey, conservatives, I need you to come out and watch the polls to make sure that liberals don't steal the vote. When in fact, he is the one who has made it his business to steal elections and to engineer elections so hard to the fact that it makes it impossible for anybody to easily vote in Georgia. And so that is just a scare tactic. And I mean, like I said before, A lot of these people are so soft, they'll melt when you challenge them, but they really are really trying to get you in a place where you are very, very afraid, and that's absolutely voter suppression. Anything like that, anything like making police officers stand at polls, all that kind of stuff, putting precincts in police stations, all that kind of stuff is voter suppression. It's just a very sneaky way of doing it. And just one other thing I'll say, and I don't want to monopolize the conversation or answering this question, but if you didn't hear anything that Miles said just now, please hear what he said about not waiting until election day to vote. I know it's very exciting to wait until election day and you get caught up in the hoopla, but that is literally the worst thing you could do this year. Make it your business to go and vote early. Or if you're going to use absentee, make sure you use a drop box to drop off your ballots. But the worst thing you can do is wait until the day of to vote. Find out when early voting is open. Every state has early voting, and make it your business to get there during early voting.
Yeah, I agree. And it's absolutely voter suppression. And I think, you know, it's in line with the fact that he's an illegitimate president, right? So the only way that he can continue is if he suppresses the vote so people don't come out to vote. I think it's very dangerous. I think he's inciting violence. And I think that not just voter suppression, he's actually advocating for violence. So, you know, as Renitta and Miles said, there are a lot of important steps to take to make sure that the best way to avoid these conflicts is to avoid these conflicts. So vote early, vote by mail if you can, and make sure that, you know, you follow up to make sure your vote has been counted.
So I just want to let everyone know who's watching that the chat is now open too, if you'd like to put comments in there. I think Renitta maybe mentioned the ACLU, but it would be great to know, ask one person, like, what are some organizations, and that may also be national organizations with local affiliates, that are geared towards supporting voter turnout, but also protecting voters, especially in traditionally disempowered communities. He's looking to support them, and I'm sure others are too.
Yeah, Fair Fight, which started here in Georgia, it's an organization that Stacey Abrams started. Actually, they're going national this year in making sure to help protect election integrity and make sure that we have free and fair elections. So you can look up fairfight.org. I'm trying to think of, I know Common Cause works on stuff. There are quite a few organizations that definitely need your assistance.
I'll mention two. One is State Voices, which is an organization led by a fabulous woman named Alexis Anderson Reed. And we are the coordinating, I'm on the board, we are the coordinating organization for 23 state tables, including pro-Georgia. That's why I asked you about Tamika. And you know, those tables, those organizations are coordinating efforts to get people to the polls and to make sure they're registered. So if you go through State Voices, you can find the individual state one. And then the other one is there's an election protection program, which Common Cause you mentioned was involved in, and the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. And they have a number that they have, a phone number, 1-866-OUR-VOTE. And if there are any problems on election day or any issues or any questions about polling places, et cetera, just remember that it's a national toll-free number, 1-866-OUR-VOTE.
Mijin, do you want to add anything, or? Okay. So I think I want to ask this question, which I thought was interesting because it's kind of, you'll see, but I think it's like reflects to the flip side of like what we see some of the conservative and reactionary forces doing that Representative Shannon had a firsthand experience of, with like people providing legislation, helping out the people in charge. So the person from Denver asked, I've heard of some organizations that are trying to create a kind of quote unquote liberal or quote unquote left ALEC, which is mentioned in Mijin's chapter, but that's like a legislative, for those who don't know, it's a legislative body, very pro-corporate legislative lobbying group that like writes bills that people can then just like literally insert the state name and then put it in. To outsourcing the staff and policy work for liberal state electeds who have to work full time in addition to serving on the state legislature. Do you see this as a positive development or something that will continue to further ossify the current way of doing things? I thought that was an interesting question, but I don't know the answer to it.
Yeah, that's a great question. There is an organization that does exist. It's called SIX, and it's State Innovation Exchange organization, something like that. And I would say that they are helpful. So the way the process works is if you have an idea for a bill, there is something called Legislative Council, which is a group of attorneys that works for every state legislature. Every state legislature has their own, and they will take whatever your bill idea is, and then we'll turn it into an actual bill. They'll put it in legalese and turn it into an actual bill that you can start to collect signatures on and move forward. I would say that the way that SIX works is very different than the way that ALEC works, because ALEC really, as David mentioned, they literally create bills and say, hey, we're going to run this across the country. Everybody do it the same way. There's been incidents where we've seen legislators turn in bills where it still says ALEC on the top of it. So we know that they, got it directly from ALEC, and they're not even thinking about what they're sponsoring. The benefit, I think that the benefit and what SIX is doing, which they help me out sometimes, not because of time constraints, but one of the things is I don't trust every single thing that comes out of Legislative Council here in Georgia, because they work for the majority party, which is the Republicans. Now they're supposed to be nonpartisan, but at the end of the day, if the speaker is the one who gives you your job, I know that number one, you're probably not going to prioritize my legislation as far as getting it out. And I'm not saying anything about anybody individually. I'm just saying that for me, knowing that, I only ran because of the issues and I'm only here for the issues is the only reason I stay. I want to make sure that the bills that I am asking to be created really are tight bills that do reflect progressive values and don't leave gaps and holes. So for me, I do use SIX, this organization, to help me research what has legislation in other states look like that, have best practices. Let's say, for example, if you want to, make sure that automatic voter registration is expanded, what have other states done? And so I would say this organization is very helpful because they're able to take time to do research where being in the minority party, you simply don't have those types of resources, where the majority party, basically state taxpayers are paying for it because they're in the majority, and so it can all go under legislative work when it really is party work. So I would say that SIX is the only organization I know of that is similar to an ALEC, but they do not have the same cultural bend as ALEC, meaning they're not here to, they're more of a resource, like, hey, can you research something for me? Or can you help me draft a bill? They're more of a resource. And there's never been a time where I've been approached like, hey, we've got this bill that we just want everyone to run across the country.
I'll start with a small funny story from my days in the Connecticut legislature about ALEC. Renitta is exactly right. ALEC would do a big mailing, and here are our bills for this year. And so in Connecticut, there was a thing called the list of bills. It was a booklet that came out every day for the month before the legislative session starts. And then one day, you would see 25 Republican legislators put in a bill to make English the official language of the state of Connecticut, so that would prohibit voter registration cards from being printed in Spanish and all those things. And we would all say, okay, the ALEC mailing has arrived, because what the legislators would do, they wouldn't even open it. They would just give it to their clerk or their intern and say, go take this down to the legislative drafting office that Renitta's talked about, and get it filed. But I would echo that I think SIX, the State Innovation Exchange, is kind of the most equivalent on our side. But I'll say this, I think that there is the real possibility next year, and this being kind of our focus on democracy issues, that a suite that if there are good, solid results and Democratic majorities or split legislatures in more places, to really introduce a suite of democratic reform bills with a small d. Automatic voter registration, same-day registration, restoration of voting rights for people with felony convictions, pre-registration of 16 and 17-year-olds, early voting, expanded mail-in voting, which obviously many states are just going to be coming right off of, redistricting commissions, campaign finance reform, public financing bills, voucher bills, matching fund bills. And we see this, by the way, in Congress. This is essentially what H.R. 1 is. And I think H.R. 1 will get a new lease on life, come January. But I would love to see in my dreams that in states around the country, a package of pro-voter democracy reforms is introduced in the 2021 legislature, including gerrymandering issues. And, we give it our best to try to do for pro-democracy issues what was done for anti-democracy issues after the Tea Party wave of 2010.
Yeah.
I'll just speak briefly to the second part of the question, which is, is this development good, or is it just a continuation of the broken system? And I think that's the wrong question. I think that the better, maybe a different question is, how do we best counter what's currently happening? Because, we can talk about whether or not we think the system is broken, and obviously the system is broken and what we need to replace it. But in the meantime, very bad things are happening to a lot of people. And so you have to engage, right? So regardless of whether we think it's a good idea or whether it continues a corrupt system, ALEC exists. So the only option we have is to counter ALEC. It doesn't mean that's all we do, but in some sense, we can't not engage with the current system and expect better outcomes, right? Very bad things are happening that are really hurting a lot of people in our current system. And we need to engage in that, which is why you have to vote, even though we are talking about all the problems with voting and all the problems with our system. But millions of people have died for the right to vote. You have to vote. You have to engage in the current system while you're also trying to change the system.
Yeah, and I think I would just add quickly is that there's also two other equivalents to 6. There's local progress, which actually has some Democratic Socialists and DSA electeds on its board, which does it for the municipal level, 6 the state, and then there's, and recently actually created, which it's not totally equivalent, but the Congressional Caucus Progressive Center, which is the 501c3 wing of the Progressive Caucus in Congress, also is striving. So these are like 3 organizations that I remember from my days in DC that are coming together really to fill a real role that's needed. So I'm gonna do like 2 more questions because I know it's getting late. So one is, I'm gonna kind of expand on it a little bit, but the person was asking if there's been any corporate efforts to target and suppress climate voters. And I think and I also would like to expand that because we tend to also think of, and very importantly, that race is very central in voter suppression in this country. But it'd be actually interesting, in addition to the climate, if there's any other forms of voter suppression that are targeted, that are corporate dominated, that, besides race, that we might not know about, that, Mijin, you can maybe we can start with you first and then open up to others. I thought it was an interesting question that I hadn't thought about.
In terms of voter suppression, I think, they do it indirectly by saying that, the system is so great, you can't change it, right? That I think really dissuades people from voting. I think the more nefarious part of the fossil fuel industry is their lobbying. They spend so much money lobbying, they spend so much money on campaign contributions. And speaking of, ALEC type things, they often write legislation for elected officials. They, pack hearings with people who claim to be in favor of fossil fuels. They really distort our democracy. So I think, they suppress voter will in several ways. I think the attack on voting rights may be more indirect, but they also, fund a bunch of organizations that, attack the right to vote. So I think that their tentacles are everywhere. I think that they are trying to distort our democracy. They're trying to ensure that we have carbon lock-in so that we'll have the worst impacts of climate change. And I think they do it, what is, really troubling is they do it often through legal means. So again, just another plug for everyone needs to vote because we need different people in office because we need different decisions to be made.
I don't want to sound like a corporate apologist here, but one thing that is worth noting is that there has been a real push among corporations a lot of corporations, not all corporations, to encourage their employees to vote. There's an initiative called A Time to Vote that 700 companies, Patagonia and, the kind of usual suspects, but a lot more, which are committing to give their employees time off to go vote this year and are, making sure that they are giving out information or connecting people to TurboVote or some organization that has the information about voting places. So I think there's actually something happening where there's a kind of a civil society movement afoot in a positive way, kind of a united front almost to say, we want to take our democracy back. We want to rescue it. We want to save it. We want to improve it. We want people to encourage people to participate. And, I think there's a small, but determined band of people who are opposing that and seeking to, protect the racist vestiges of the old order. But I'm hopeful that they're going to sort of be overwhelmed by a democracy wave.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I agree with Mijin on the issue of the lobbyists when it comes to climate change. I don't see like a direct targeting of climate voters, but I just do see a direct targeting of legislators by those who don't want to see anything good for climate change or good for yeah, for climate change actually happen. And so they make it their business to build relationships with both parties, the majority, the minority, so that they are covered no matter who ends up taking power. Um, I, when I came into office, I made a list of industries and corporations that I would not take checks from. And Georgia Power is on that list, and they've never offered me a check. Also, I think they know that it wouldn't go, wouldn't do anything for. Same thing with Walmart and others, but so I think that that's where a lot of the influence is really happening, is with the lobbyists who are making it their business to keep such a stronghold. And I just always found that fascinating because I don't know, I guess just coming from a background of community organizing and knowing that you're there for the people, I never quite understood why legislators would put so much stock in lobbyists because, you know, to tell you the truth, a lot of these lobbyists, they, when you look at disclosures, the beholding, how beholden some legislators are to relying on lobbyists to help their reelection campaigns. Some of them are not even getting a lot of checks, but for some reason they feel that lobbyists are their boss, and I just don't understand it. So that's all I have on that.
Okay, so I'm going to ask, I'm going to amalgamate some of the questions into one broader question, which I'll encourage you guys to maybe pick one or two parts out in the last go around. But I also want to note, I think it's really interesting what Representative Shannon also brought up broadly, because this is we're Democratic Socialists, you know, fund that's bringing together. And there's a fascinating dynamic of when you elect people, the pressures they have, and that people who do have good values, you know, need also support from, you know, from like the DSA and also other organizations around it, because they can't just operate alone, or else people get pressure. And I think what's fascinating about Ocasio-Cortez, Representative Ocasio-Cortez, is because she's so well funded by small donors, she doesn't have to do the call time, which actually enables her. I think it's something people don't talk about a lot, which is she can do a lot more great work because she actually is not, because like she's not a freshman congressperson who has to spend, who I just know this from DC, they are mandated usually by the party to spend hours on the phone, and she can just be like, I'm not going to do that. And Pelosi, because we have a weak party system, Pelosi can't do that much, you know, to make those calls. But that's hours that she could spend on movement work, you know, and that people lose. So there's plenty of other reforms, like, so centering New York City. So New York City recently passed ranked choice voting, which unfortunately has not had, unfortunately is very key. It's like there hasn't been the public education campaign that groups intended because of COVID, because so I have personal fears that a lot of people are going to go to vote next year and not know what ranked choice voting is. So that's one system reform. You know, New York State also has fusion voting where you can run on multiple parties. And a few states have this, I think, as well. There's also jungle primaries, which California has, which are also more, you know, called top two primaries, where it doesn't matter what party, it's the top two voter getters in the first round. Go ahead. And then there's and those are kind of three reforms that progressives and and conservatives also like sometimes support, sometimes don't. And if you guys, whoever can take it first, but it'll be interesting to know if you think there's a Democratic Socialist, you know, reason to support these. Or do they actually work as good government programs? You know, it is interesting because I think I've seen people, especially DSA in New York City on ranked choice voting, the vast majority voted for it, but so did the city. So it wasn't actually, you know, so there wasn't actually as much of a socialist case for it as much as it was a good government reform. So I'm wondering if you think of those three reforms, there's one you like more and you feel actually deals specifically with like weakening ruling class power and weakening corporate power, or are they all just kind of nice ideas?
No, I definitely support ranked choice voting. I think that when we talk about how much support there is for DSA type policies, I think that ranked choice voting would allow folks to be able to actually prove that in real time through voting, because it removes that whole lesser of the two evils situation, and then people can actually just vote for who they want to vote for. And so I definitely think that ranked choice voting is something that the electorate overall would appreciate, and it's certainly something that DSA should support.
Yeah, I agree. I think the same could be said about fusion voting. Basically, we need to break out of this two-party system, right? And so I think as long as there's this threat of the spoiler, you'll never be able to break away from the two-party system. So ranked choice voting, fusion voting. And I think it's also instructive to remember that democracies across the world have all of these things, right? Like we are an outlier in many ways. And even though we claim to be the greatest democracy in the world, we have some really and anti-democratic practices. So these are just ways to kind of increase, I think, seats at the table, right? So we break out of this Democrat versus Republican and really kind of have more parties, more voices, and then that becomes more representative.
David, I want to put a fourth reform on the table here. This is sort of a radical proposal, but if this would seem like the right place to raise it, would it not? Anyway, I think we ought to seriously think about making voting compulsory. In Australia, since 1924, it has been a requirement that every citizen go and cast a vote. You don't have to vote for a particular candidate. You can leave your ballot blank. You can choose none of the above. But every citizen has to go and vote, or send in a mail-in ballot. Since 1924, this is 100 years now we're talking about, they have almost 90% turnout in every election. Can you imagine the difference it would make in terms of who has power and who is voting, who is participating, if we had 90% voting participation? The libertarians and the kind of the right wing will oppose this for sure, partly because they don't want everybody to vote. The smaller the vote, the better they like it. And this is the ultimate flipping of that equation. Now, it's interesting. It's not like this is a, wild and crazy idea. We do this with jury service. You are required as a citizen to serve on juries. And for precisely the same reason, to make sure that the people who are judging a person's guilt or innocence are reflective of the population as a whole, the jury of your peers. Same thing applies, I think, to voting. So I've been working very closely with E.J. Dion, who's a fabulous journalist. We've had a universal voting working group, partly of the Brookings Institution and partly of the Ash Center at the Kennedy School. We just issued a report called Lift Every Voice, the Urgency of Universal Civic Duty Voting. And what we're hoping to do is, really push this idea into the agendas of organizations like the DSA, like Common Cause, like the Center for Popular Democracy, and really try to get it into some of the legislatures next year. So you heard this first from me. No, you didn't actually, because if you read Mijin's chapter, she talks about compulsory voting in the chapter as well. But I think this is a reform that has not been discussed at all, but I think it's serious. I think it's plausible. I think it's doable. And I think it ought to become part of the democracy agenda starting after the election. Don't make it part of your election campaign, Renitta, but we'll talk afterwards.
Well, unfortunately, our time is up. So I want to thank everyone who was involved in bringing this event together. So first, our panelists, Mijin, Miles, and Renitta, you, the audience, of course, and thank you all for your questions. You'll receive follow-up emails about upcoming events. But I also want to just give a quick plug for first Dissent. So this is actually the issue that Miles' article is in. I want to thank Dissent again, and so that would be, and Flynn Murray, the staff who has helped us tremendously. Emily Janayakaram, who helped from the New Press, who helped publish the book. And Michael Grohusky from DSA staff, who did a lot of the technical work, and of course, Sunshine Rudder and Michael Bennett from the DSA Fund, the program director and chair, respectively. So we really want to thank you all for this event, and also, this book is about the bright democratic socialist future to come, and so this will involve many discussions such as this. So thank you, and really want to wish everyone a good night, and let's really hit the pavement for a good result this November from the top to the bottom. So thank you so much.